Lestat had a musician friend in the Rue de Maine. We had seen him at a recital in the home of Madame Leclerc, who lived there also, which was at that time an extremely fashionable street, and this Madame Leclerc, with whom Lestat was also occasionally amusing himself, had found the musician a room in another mansion nearby, where Lestat visited him often. I told you he played with his victims, made friends with them, seduced them into trusting and liking him, even loving him, before he killed. So he apparently played with this young boy, though it had gone on longer than any other such friendship I had ever observed. The young boy wrote good music, and often Lestat brought fresh sheets of it home and played the songs on the square grand in the parlour. The boy had a great talent, but you could tell that this music would not sell, because it was too disturbing. Lestat gave him money and spent evening after evening with him, often taking him to restaurants the boy could have never afforded, and he bought him all the paper and pens which he needed for the writing of his music. As I said, it had gone on far longer than any such friendship Lestat had ever had, and I could not tell whether he actually became fond of a mortal in spite of himself, or was simply moving towards a particularly grand betrayal and cruelty. Several times he'd indicated to Claudia and me that he was headed out to kill the boy directly, but he had not, and, of course, I never asked him what he felt, because it wasn't worth the great uproar my question would have produced. Lestat entranced with a mortal. He probably would have destroyed the parlour furniture in a rage. The next night, after which I just described to you, he jarred me miserably by asking me to go with him to the boy's flat. He was positively friendly, in one of those moods when he wanted my companionship. Enjoyment could bring that out of him. Wanting to see a good play, the regular opera, the ballet, he always wanted me along. I think I must have seen Macbeth with him 15 times. We went to every performance, even those by amateurs, and Lestat would stride home afterwards, repeating the lines to me, and even shouting out to passers-by with outstretched finger, "Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow," until they skirted him as if he were drunk. But this effervescence was frenetic, and likely to vanish in an instant. Just a word or two of amiable feeling on my part, some suggestion that I found his companionship pleasant, could banish all such affairs for months, even years. But now he came to me in such a mood, and asked me to go to the boy's room. He was not above pressing my arm as he urged me, and I, dull, catatonic, gave him some miserable excuse, thinking only of Claudia, of the agent, of imminent disaster. I could feel it and wondered that he did not feel it. And finally he picked up a book from the floor and threw it at me, shouting, "Read your damn poems, then! Rot!" And he bounded out. This disturbed me. I cannot tell you how it disturbed me. I wished him cold, impassive, gone. I resolved to plead with Claudia to drop this. I felt powerless and hopelessly fatigued. But her door had been locked until she left, and I had glimpsed her only for a second while Lestat was chattering, a vision of lace and loveliness as she slipped on her coat, puffed sleeves again, and a violet ribbon on her breast, her white lace stockings showing beneath the hem of the little gown, and her white slippers immaculate. She cast a cold look at me as she went out. When I returned later, satiated and for a while too sluggish for my own thoughts to bother me, I gradually began to sense that this was the night. She would try tonight. I cannot tell you how I knew this. Things about the flat disturbed me, altered me. Claudia moved in the back parlour behind closed doors, and I fancied I heard another voice there, a whisper. Claudia never brought anyone to our flat. No one did except Lestat, who brought his women of the streets. But I knew there was someone there. Yet I got no strong scent, no proper sounds, and then there were aromas in the air of food and drink, and chrysanthemums stood in the silver vase on the square grand, flowers which, to Claudia, meant death. Then Lestat came, singing something soft under his breath. his walking stick making a rat-tat-tat on the rails of spiral stairs. He came down the long hall, his face flushed from the kill, his lips pink, and he set his music on the piano. "Did I kill him, or did I not kill him?" He flashed the question at me now with a pointing finger. "What's your guess?" "You did not," I said numbly, "because you invited me to go with you, and would never have invited me to share that kill." "Ah, but did I kill him in a rage because you would not go with me?" he said, and threw back the cover from the keys. I could see that he would be able to go on like this until dawn. He was exhilarated. I watched him flip through the music, thinking, can he die? Can he actually die? And does she mean to do this? At one point I wanted to go to her and tell her we must abandon everything, even the proposed trip, and live as we had before. But I had the feeling now that there was no retreat. Since the day she'd begun to question him, this, whatever it was to be, was inevitable. And I felt a weight on me, holding me in the chair. He pressed 2 chords with his hands. He had an immense reach, and even in life could have been a fine pianist. But he played without feeling. He was always outside the music, drawing it out of the piano as if by magic, by the virtuosity of his vampire senses and control. The music did not come through him, was not drawn through him by himself. "Well, did I kill him?" he asked me again. "No, you did not," I said again, though I could just as easily have said the opposite. I was concentrating on keeping my face a mask. "You're right. I did not," he said. "It excites me to be close to him, to think over and over, I can kill him, and I will kill him. But not now. And then to leave him and find someone who looks as nearly like him as possible. If he had brothers, why, I'd kill them one by one. The family would come to a mysterious fever which dried up the very blood in their bodies," he said, now mocking a Barker's tone. "Claudia has a taste for families." "Speaking of families, I suppose you heard. The Frenier place is supposed to be haunted. They can't keep an overseer, and the slaves run away." This was something I did not wish to hear in particular. Babette had died young, insane, restrained finally from wandering towards the ruins of Point du Lac, insisting she had seen the devil there and must find him. I'd heard of it in wisps of gossip, and then came the funeral notices. I'd thought occasionally of going to her, of trying some way to rectify what I had done. And other times I thought it would all heal itself, and in my new life of nightly killing I had grown far from the attachment I'd felt for her or for my sister or any mortal. And I watched the tragedy finally as one might from a theatre balcony, moved from time to time, but never sufficiently to jump the railing and join the players on the stage. "Don't talk of her," I said. "Very well. I was talking of the plantation, not her. Her, your lady love, your fancy." He smiled at me. "You know, I had it all my way finally in the end, didn't I? But I was telling you about my young friend and how I wish you would play the music," I said softly, unobtrusively, but as persuasively as possible. Sometimes this worked with Lestat. If I said something just right, he found himself doing what I'd said. And now he did just that, with a little snarl as if to say, "You fool." He began playing the music. I heard the doors of the back parlor open and Claudia's steps move down the hall. "Don't come, Claudia," I was thinking, feeling. "Go away from it before we're all destroyed." But she came on steadily until she reached the hall mirror. I could hear her opening the small table drawer, and then the zinging of her hairbrush. She was wearing a floral perfume. I turned slowly to face her as she appeared in the door, still all in white, and moved across the carpet silently towards the piano. She stood at the end of the keyboard, her hands folded on the wood, her chin resting on her hands, her eyes fixed on Lestat. I could see his profile and her small face beyond, looking up at him. "What is it now?" he said, turning the page and letting his hand drop to his thigh. "You irritate me. Your very presence irritates me." His eyes moved over the page. "Does it?" she said in her sweetest voice. "Yes, it does. And I'll tell you something else. I've met someone who would make a better vampire than you." This stunned me, but I didn't have the urge for him to ask him to go on. "Do you get my meaning?" he said to her. "Is it supposed to frighten me?" she asked. "You're spoiled because you're an only child," he said. "You need a brother, or rather, I need a brother. I get weary of you both, greedy, brooding vampires that haunt our own lives. I dislike it." "I suppose we could people the world with vampires, the three of us," she said. "You think so?" he said, smiling, his voice with a note of triumph. "Do you think you could do it? I suppose Louis has told you how it was done, or how he thinks it was done. You don't have the power, either of you," he said. This seemed to disturb her, something she had not accounted for. She was studying him. I could see she did not entirely believe him. "And what gave you the power?" she asked softly, but with a touch of sarcasm. "That, my dear, is one of those things which you must never know, for even the Erebus in which we live must have its aristocracy." "You're a liar," she said with a short laugh, and just as he touched his fingers on the keys again, she said, "But you upset my plans." "Your plans?" he asked. "I came to make peace with you, even if you are the father of lies." "You're my father," she said. "I want to make peace with you. I want things to be as they were." Now he was the one who did not believe. Now he was the one who did not believe. He threw a glance at me, then looked at her. "That can't be. Just stop asking me questions. Stop following me. Stop searching in every alleyway for other vampires. There are no other vampires. And this is where you live, and this is where you stay." He looked confused for the moment, as if raising his own voice had confused him. "I take care of you. You don't need anything." "And you don't know anything, and that is why you detest my questions. All that's clear. So now let's have peace, because there's nothing else to be had. I have a present for you. And I hope it's a beautiful woman with endowments you'll never possess," he said, looking her up and down. Her face changed when he did this. It was as if she almost lost some control I'd never seen her lose. But she just shook her head and reached out one small, rounded arm and tugged at his sleeve. "I meant what I said. I'm weary of arguing with you. Hell is hatred. People living together in eternal hatred. We're not in hell. You can't take the present or not. I don't care. You can take the present or not. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Only let's have an end to all this before Louis, in disgust, leaves us both." She was urging him now to leave the piano, bringing down the wooden cover again over the eyes, turning him on the piano stool until his eyes followed her to the door. "You're serious? Present? What do you mean, present?" "You haven't fed enough. I can tell by the color, by your eyes. You've never fed enough at this hour. Let's say that I can give you a precious moment. Suffer the little children to come unto me," she whispered, and was gone. He looked at me. I said nothing. I might as well have been drugged. I could see the curiosity in his face, the suspicion. He followed her down the hall, and then I heard him let out a long, conscious moan, a perfect mingling of hunger and lust. When I reached the door, and I took my time, he was bending over the settee. 2 small boys lay there, nestled among the soft velvet pillows, totally abandoned to sleep as children can be, their pink mouths open, their small round faces utterly smooth. Their skin was moist, radiant, the curls of the darker of the two damp and pressed to the forehead. I saw at once by their pitiful and identical clothes that they were orphans, and they had ravaged a meal set before them on our best china. The tablecloth was stained with wine, and a small bottle stood half full among the greasy plates and forks. But there was an aroma in the room I did not like. I moved closer, better to see the sleeping ones, and I could see their throats were bare but untouched. Lestat had sunk down beside the darker one. He was by far the more beautiful. He might have been lifted to the painted dome of a cathedral. No more than 7 years old, he had the perfect beauty that is of neither sex, but angelic. Lestat brought his hand down gently on the pale throat, and then he touched the silken lips. He let out a sigh which had again that longing, that sweet, painful anticipation. "Oh, Claudia," he sighed, "you've outdone yourself. Where did you find them?" She said nothing. She had receded to a dark armchair and sat back against 2 large pillows, her legs out straight on the rounded cushion, her ankles dropping so that you did not see the bottom of her white slippers, but the curved insteps and the tight, delicate little straps. She was staring at Lestat. "Drunk on brandy wine," she said. "A thimbleful." "Drunk on brandy wine," she said. "A thimbleful," and gestured to the table. "I thought of you when I saw them. I thought if I share this with him, even he will forgive." He was warmed by her flattery. He looked at her now and reached out and clutched her white lace ankle. "Ducky," he whispered to her and laughed, and then he hushed as if he didn't wish to wake the doomed children. He gestured to her, intimately, seductively. "Come, sit beside him. You take him and I'll take this one. Come." He embraced her as she passed and nestled beside the other boy. He stroked the boy's moist hair. He ran his fingers over the rounded lids and along the fringe of lashes. And then he put his whole softened hand across the boy's face and felt at the temples, cheeks, and jaw, massaging the unblemished flesh. He had forgotten I was there, or she was there, but he withdrew his hand and sat still for a moment, as though his desire was making him dizzy. He glanced at the ceiling and then down at the perfect feast. He turned the boy's head slowly against the back of the couch, and the boy's eyebrows tensed for an instant, and a moan escaped his lips. Claudia's eyes were steady on Lestat, though now she raised her left hand and slowly undid the buttons of the child who lay beside her, and reached inside the shabby little shirt and felt the bare flesh. Lestat did the same, but suddenly it was as if his hand had life itself, and drew his arm into the shirt and around the boy's small chest in a tight embrace. And Lestat slid down off the cushions of the couch to his knees on the floor, his arm locked to the boy's body, pulling it up close to him so that his face was buried in the boy's neck. His lips moved over the neck and over the chest, and over the tiny nipple of the chest, and then, putting his other arm into the open shirt, so that the boy lay hopelessly wound in both arms, he drew the boy up tight and sank his teeth into his throat. The boy's head fell back again, the curls loose as he was lifted, and again he let out a small moan, and his eyelids fluttered but never opened. And Lestat knelt, the boy pressed against him, sucking hard, his own back arched and rigid, his body rocking back and forth carrying the boy, his long moans rising and falling in time with the slow rocking, until suddenly his whole body tensed, and his hands seemed to grope for some way to push the boy away, as if the boy himself in his helpless slumber were clinging to Lestat. And finally he embraced the boy again, and moved slowly forward over him, letting him down among the pillows, the sucking softer, now almost inaudible. He withdrew. His hands pressed the boy down, He knelt there, his head thrown back, so the wavy blonde hair hung loose and dishevelled, and then he slowly sank to the floor, turning his back against the leg of the couch. "Gods!" he whispered, his head back, his lids half-masked. I could see the colour rushing to his cheeks rushing into his hands. One hand lay on his bent knee, fluttering, and then it lay still. Claudia had not moved. She was like a Botticelli angel beside the unharmed boy. The other's body already withered, the neck like a fractured stem, the heavy head falling now at an odd angle, the angle of death into the pillow. But something was wrong. Lestat was staring at the ceiling. I could see his tongue between his teeth. He lay too still, the tongue, as it were, trying to get out of the mouth, trying to move past the barrier of the teeth and touch the lip. He appeared to shiver, his shoulders convulsing, then relaxing heavily, yet he did not move. A veil had fallen over his clear grey eyes. He was peering at the ceiling. Then a sound came out of him. I stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway, and Claudia said with a sharp hiss, "Go back." "Louis," he was saying. I could hear it now. "Louis, Louis." "Don't you like it, Lestat?" she asked him. "Something's wrong with it," he gasped, and his eyes widened as if the mere speaking were a colossal effort. He could not move. I saw it. He could not move at all. "Claudia!" He gasped again, and his eyes rolled towards her. "Don't you like the taste of children's blood?" she asked softly. "Louis," he whispered, finally lifting his head just for an instant. It fell back on the couch. "Louis, it's absinthe. Too much absinthe," he gasped. "She's poisoned them with it. She's poisoned me, Louis." He tried to raise his hand. I drew nearer, the table between us. "Stay back," she said again, and now she slid off the couch and approached him, peering down into his face as she had peered at the child. "Absinthe, father," she said, "and laudanum." "Demon," he said to her. "Louis, put me in my coffin." He struggled to rise. "Put me in my coffin." His voice was hoarse, barely audible. The hand fluttered, lifted, and fell back. "I'll put you in your coffin, father," she said, as though she were soothing him. "I'll put you in it forever." And then from beneath the pillows of the couch she drew a kitchen knife. "Claudia, don't do this thing," I said to her. But she flashed at me a virility I'd never seen on her face, and as I stood there paralyzed, she gashed his throat and let out a sharp, choking, and he let out a sharp, choking cry. "God!" he shouted. "God!" The blood poured out of him, down his shirt front, down his coat. It poured as it might never pour from a human being. All the blood which he had filled himself before the child. All the blood which he had filled himself before the child and from the child. And he kept turning his head, twisting, making the bubbling gash gape. She sank the knife into his chest now and pitched forward, his mouth wide, his fangs exposed, both hands convulsively flying towards the knife, fluttering around its handle, slipping off its handle. He looked up at me, the hair falling down into his eyes. "Louis, Louis!" He let out one more gasp and fell sideways on the carpet. She stood looking down at him. The blood flowed everywhere like water. He was groaning, trying to raise himself, one arm pinned beneath his chest, the other shoving at the floor. And now, suddenly, she flew at him, and clamping both arms around his neck, bit deep into him as he struggled. "Louis, Louis!" He gasped over and over, struggling, trying desperately to throw her off. But she rode him, her body lifted by his shoulder, hoisted and dropped until she pulled away, and, finding the floor quickly, she backed away from him, her hands to her lips, her eyes for the moment clouded, then clear. I turned away from her, my body convulsed by what I'd seen, unable to look any longer. "Louis," she said, but I only shook my head. For a moment the whole house seemed to sway. But she said, "Look what's happening to him." He had ceased to move. He lay now on his back, and his entire body was shriveling, drying up, the skin thick and wrinkled, and so white that all the tiny veins showed through it. I gasped, but I could not take my eyes off it, even as the shape of the bones began to show through. His lips drawing back from his teeth, the flesh of his nose drying to 2 gaping holes. But his eyes, they remained the same, staring wildly at the ceiling, the irises dancing from side to side, even as the flesh cleaved to the bones. Became nothing but a parchment, wrapping for the bones, the clothes hollow and limp over the skeleton that remained. Finally the irises rolled to the top of his head, and the whites of his eyes went dim. The thing lay still, a great mass of wavy blonde hair, a coat, a pair of gleaming boots, and this horror that had been Lestat, and I staring helplessly at it. And that is where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, so that's another 10 pages. What are some of the cool things that went on here? I think the first thing to talk about is the fact that Lestat has found for himself a new target of obsession, a new individual that he desires to possess in the form of the artist boy. I think this says a couple of things for us. I think the first thing is that it reaffirms the general taste of Lestat in regards to the kind of person he would want to turn into a vampire. My prior observation that Claudia was really an exception to what he would typically desire to turn into a vampire holds kind of true. The only reason he really turned Claudia was to get to Louis, not for any desire contrary to that. I think that stands fairly safely. But also, I think it just reaffirms this notion of Lestat as needing to control or possess individuals. Because, as we've seen, Lestat is kind of realizing that he's losing a bit of his control over Louis and Claudia. I don't think he realizes so much with Louis, because Louis is quite conflicted, but I definitely think he realizes with Claudia that he doesn't have the same degree of control that he used to have. And so he needs to find someone else. He says himself to Claudia that I found someone who will make a far better vampire than you ever could, or something to that effect. This notion that he is A, going to replace her with an individual he can control easier, but B, there is also a hint of desiring to make Claudia jealous functionally, and with that use this new vampire he intends to create in order to gain further control over her. So he's just again trying to consolidate his power and control and manipulation over individuals. Another interesting thing to this dimension with Lestat's new obsession is that there is a shift in the dynamic in which, with Louis, originally, Louis was the one with money, and so Lestat was acting as an economic parasite upon Louis so that he could live his lavish lifestyle. We're seeing something of an inversion with that now, where Lestat is financing this boy. He's basically becoming an artistic patron for this boy. That would at first appear to throw my observation regarding Lestat's economic parasitism through a bit of a loop, but I don't think it really affects it that much at all. And if anything, it strengthens it, because Lestat, the only reason Lestat is capable of doing this consistent financing is because he is draining money off of Louis. He is financially draining Louis, and indeed has recently convinced Louis to... Well, sorry, he hasn't convinced Louis, but Louis has recently signed some properties over to him. I don't know if Lestat knows that he has those properties signed over to him yet. I'm not sure. But the point still stands that Lestat has a great deal of financial control over Louis, and so therefore he can afford to finance this new obsession of his. And indeed, I think it hints that Lestat wants to have financial control over someone else, in the way that Louis technically has financial control over him. Louis, of course, doesn't have true financial control, because Lestat controls Louis's finances, but it's technically Louis's money, whereas Lestat wants to have an individual financially dependent upon him so that he can better control and manipulate that individual. So I think that's what we're seeing with this new artistic target of Lestat's obsession, and I think that's going to be really interesting to look at going forward. Another thing we find out in this segment is the fate of Babette. You remember Babette? She was here about 100 pages ago, and interesting. Like I was actually just thinking the other day. I can't remember what happens to Babette. Do they even ever mention Babette again? And it would be reasonable to forget about what happens to Babette, because it only actually gets mentioned over the course of about a page. But essentially, Babette has become a kind of vengeful, tormented ghost that haunts the Fernier plantation. And I think what the mentioning of this fact serves a couple of purposes. The first, it highlights how terrible Louis' idea was ultimately. How terrible Louis' quote-unquote detached interfering with other people's lives in order to make himself this kind of supernatural angel figure, when in reality he's not really capable of helping anything. It proves that was kind of a bad idea, ultimately. Because, as I've observed a few times now, it feels like Babette would have been fine on her own. There's nothing really that makes me think Babette wouldn't have been capable of managing things by herself. And indeed, everything suggests that she would have been completely fine managing things by herself, until Louis throws this supernatural spanner into the mix and just makes everything, drives her mad, essentially, through this superstition that he claims she isn't beholden to. Well, obviously she was in the end, because she got driven mad by the notion of this devil visiting her from the other plantation, because he was that devil. It's kind of interesting. We never actually get to properly hear from Babette. I think Babette's story would benefit from a little bit of time where we just get to hear Babette talk to us and tell us what her thought process was, what she was considering in that plantation. But it's also fitting that we never actually get to properly hear from Babette, because Louis never actually tries to listen to Babette. Louis never actually asks Babette or wants to hear from Babette. Louis decides what he thinks is best for Babette. And so that's why ultimately we don't really get to hear from her, because Louis ruined her life, functionally. I mean, Lestat technically caused the situation by killing Fernier, but Louis ruined her life. She made her situation worse through his unnecessary interference in a situation that probably would have been fine to begin with. It's kind of a throwaway plot point. It does just get mentioned in this page, but it also it gets brought up by Lestat, with the intent of belittling Louis. It's obviously brought up by Lestat to bother Louis, because he knows what Louis's like. And I guess the interesting thing is, first of all, it highlights that Lestat's a dick, but second, it concludes in this remark where Lestat mentions that, well, I got my way in the end. Everything worked out for old Lestat in the end. which is ironic because it's a remark that comes very quickly before we realize that everything hasn't worked out for old Lestat in the end. In fact, Lestat is less in control than he actually believes himself to be. He still has some sway over Louis, but Claudia is completely against him at this stage and is imminently planning to kill him. Which is fittingly to move on to some observations on the actual killing / murder. It's technically murder, but I don't know. I feel like Lestat had it coming for a while on behalf of Claudia. And the first thing to talk about in this regard is that it's quite fitting that Claudia uses 2 young boys as the targets for Lestat in order to spike him, essentially, to weaken him. 2 orphan boys, specifically, which is fitting because they represent the state that Claudia was taken to become a vampire in. She's very clearly taken these 2 orphan boys from an orphanage or a hospital in a similar way that she was taken. Except these boys serve the purpose of creating this ironic justice where these same human figures that were used to create Claudia are now being used to destroy Lestat. They also highlight Lestat's lust after children. There's no avoiding that. I don't know how you can pretend Lestat isn't sexually attracted to children. When you consider that, first of all, a child appears to be a particularly good gift to him, but also he definitely speaks of the children in sexual terms. He's moaning, he looks at them lustfully, he grabs at them, and the feeding, it takes on almost orgasmic descriptions. I get that vampire sexuality does not work the same as human sexuality in this series, but thematically, we cannot ignore the potential narrative implications of Lestat preying on children favorably in this manner. It's a dimension to his character that we can't just pretend doesn't exist, is suppose what I'm trying to say here. Lestat definitely does have an element of a child predator in his character that we can't just pretend doesn't exist. An interesting observation here regarding the boys is the boys are poisoned with a mixture of absinthe and laudanum. And the usage of laudanum by Claudia, there's 2 interesting dimensions to this. The first thing is the fact that the boys are poisoned, I think, represents Claudia's craftiness in this regard. Because Claudia clearly has the intelligence to recognize that she cannot physically fight Lestat. And so, in a crafty manner, she poisons him in order to overpower him after the fact. It represents it highlights Claudia's wit over her physical strength. But the specific use of laudanum here is an interesting parallel to Dracula. Because laudanum also plays a prominent role in that text. If you don't know it, by the way, in Dracula, basically every other page, a character is being given some form of morphine. Laudanum is basically an opiate. It's kind of like morphine in that. I don't know specifically what it is, but it's an opiate. Every other page in Dracula, characters are being given some morphine to help them sleep. It's kind of overbearing, really. But the specific mention of laudanum that I can think of off the top of my head is when Dracula puts Lucy's maids to sleep using laudanum so that he can sneak into Lucy's bedchamber. Which is fitting there because these boys are also being put to sleep, but rather than... Well, they are put to sleep in order to access prey, I suppose you could say. The boys are put to sleep so that Claudia can prey on Lestat in the same way that the maids are put to sleep so that Dracula can prey on Lucy. But I also think the sleeping here is a sleep of death as opposed to a sleep that can be bypassed. And I guess something to say here is there something vampiric in the narrative usage of opiates if we see it brought up in these two very, very prominent instances? And I guess the most obvious thing is there's certainly a parallel to addiction to be found in the vampire's thirst for blood. They are essentially junkies for blood. The way Louis talks about his need to feed whenever he is without blood, it is essentially descriptions of symptoms of withdrawal from this blood. He needs it and he is addicted to it very prominently in the same way one could be addicted to something like opium. I also think there is a thematic comparison of the hypnotic calming effects of an opiate and the hypnotic calming effects of vampiric hypnotism or vampiric presence and influence on mortals. Vampires, of course, very commonly creatures that would come to you in your sleep, appearing in dreams, that kind of thing. Carmilla's a great example of that. And that kind of hazy supernatural influence would be very fitting to be compared to an opiate. So I think there's something definitely to be discussed there. A final thing to mention from this set of 10 pages is that I mentioned last time that Claudia was thinking about feeding off of the blood of Lestat. In this segment, she does feed off the blood of Lestat. And I think what this really symbolizes, I think the main thing this tells us, is that in feeding off the blood of Lestat, Claudia symbolically finally takes up that position within Louis's life. In taking Lestat's blood into herself, she finally makes that final symbolic move from threatening Lestat's position of power to completely taking up Lestat's position of power over Louis. Claudia, she has been for a while, but now she really is just making all the decisions. She is in control of Louis fully and completely, and there's no one to threaten her. He may be the one about to carry her to Europe, but she is the one who's going to decide on the core details, and she is the one who Louis's service is really devoted to. Claudia is in control, and she has, as far as we can tell narratively thus far, won. We'll see how well that works out for her as the story advances. But that is another 10 pages and some more analysis. I hope you enjoyed this. I really enjoyed that section. I thought there's a lot of really cool stuff to talk about in it. And I'll see you again tomorrow for some more of Interview with the Vampire. See you then.